So again, this is our fourth lecture in the series of 2,000 years of church history, and we're almost at the year 2,000 years of church history. Our Lord traditionally is said to have ascended into heaven in the year 33. So I guess in the year 2033, 10 years from now, we should have a big party. But anyway, so we're kind of at a good place to pick up. As you will recall, we last were reflecting upon sort of this confidence, this growing confidence in Western civilization, and it was under attack by Islam in the East with the Ottomans. And you know, our word in English, slave, comes from the word Slav, right? Because the Ottomans took so many Christians from that part of the empire, and that Eastern Empire was just disintegrating. And finally the Ottomans took Constantinople, and it sort of turned corner. So suddenly our attention is back on Rome imperially, because what had been scrappy and sort of surviving at best in the early Middle Ages is now becoming a period of Renaissance. And moreover, there's a confidence in Spain, because Islam has been pushed out and Spain has been reconquered, and Isabella and Ferdinand have sent Columbus to discover the New World. And so there's this confidence growing in the West, and there's an ability to suddenly go around some of the things that were keeping us from expanding. When I say us, I mean Western civilization, because Western civilization couldn't get through Islam, but it could go around it. And so you begin to see missionaries in this period of time sent to sub-Saharan Africa, missionaries sent to India and sent to the Far East, and many missionaries sent to what is the Americas. And so it's a whole new chapter in what we call Western civilization. And tied up with that is, of course, Catholicism, because Catholicism is kind of the heart of all of that. It doesn't mean that everything that's done in the name of the West is necessarily Catholic. It's not. Because at this time we also have the Protestant Reformation, which is going to cause a lot of issues, right? And so we're kind of at that point in history. So, but recall, that the world used to be lower Europe, far Western Asia, and northern Africa. That area around the lake of basically the Mediterranean. But now the world is expanding, and there's a much broader sense of the world, and we're running into places we've never seen before. Make sure I'm going in the right direction. Okay.
That was right.
Is that the right direction?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, you see here, I can't see it. What does it say there? I'm sorry.
Well, you're at 1001.
1001. Okay, well, we've got to go forward 500 years. We're at the wrong page. Tell me when I'm at the right place. This angle's got me sort of...
All right, yeah.
Right there.
Okay, right there. Okay, so here we are. So, what's beginning to happen in Rome is the papacy, after that Avignon papacy, it's come back to Rome, and so there's a renewal of the city, there's a renewal of classical understanding, there's a renewal of classical architecture and art, and the popes are digging out Rome. And if you go to Rome, even today, some of the older churches, the streets are up here, and the courtyard that used to be on the street level is like 20 feet lower, because the city just built up trash, whatever, horse manure, human manure, all of that just stuff filled the city up. And so when the papacy goes back to Rome, it begins to sort of uncover these great ruins and learn from how they built, and it begins a renewal in architecture and a renewal in art. This is something we call the Renaissance. And that's when we begin to build St. Peter's Basilica. St. Peter's Basilica old St. Peter's had been built by Constantine, but it was falling apart. And so the new idea was to build something that would be kind of like a rival to or an answer to Hagia Sophia that had been lost in Islam. So we wanted the dome, we wanted something beautiful, right? Because we had kind of lost the old Christian capital in the East. But the building of St. Peter's also causes a bit of stir in Germany because they're trying to raise money to build it, and there are these individuals who Luther believes are selling indulgences, right? Now, all of us would say, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to trust all of that, right? I don't know if it was really selling indulgences or not. But you can understand how Catholics would be like, if you would like to make a contribution, to this, we'll make sure to pray for your ancestors. I don't know how it worked, but anyway, Luther was scandalized by it. And so he used that as sort of a reason to begin the Protestant Reformation. And I think the church very much needed to be reformed. I think the church was in a period of time where it needed reformation, but it did not need what Luther did, right? Luther brings about a schism. He brings about a problem. He doesn't really try to restore or reform the church. Catherine of Siena was trying to reform the church when she brings the papacy back to Rome. Luther is saying that the Pope is the Antichrist. So, that's a far different message. But Protestants actually and others sacked Rome in 1527. So there's a kind of high point and a low point, right? On one level, it's the beginning of a new age of exploration and a new age of art and a new age of spiritual. Our Lady of Guadalupe appears in the Americas. And I mean, it's just amazing revival, but on another level, it's also a time of chaos. And in 1529, Muslims siege Vienna. So Vienna is always sort of under, that's that Western capital that's it's on the Danube. It's on what we would think of the old eastern side of old Roman Empire. And yet it's pushing it back against the Ottomans. The Ottomans are trying, even today, you can find Islamic preachers saying that, defeat the Romans, turn St. Peter's Basilica into a mosque. They were saying that then. So it was this sort of desire to wipe out Christendom from the Ottoman East. But at the same time, this is kind of, I dare say, kind of our history too, opening up. Not that we are not a part of the old world, we are, right? We're all probably part of that old empire, or somehow part of those three continents that were part of the sort of the early sort of world, according to the Greeks. And yet, we are here. And so this is a beginning of a new chapter for many of our ancestors. And they came to these shores over a period of time, beginning at this period of time as well. And always in the midst of all of this, there is exploration, there is reformation, and there's schism, and there's war. So it's a very complicated period of history. So the Spanish are settling in La Florida. That's where our 5 Georgian martyrs are from, in that early Spanish colonial days. But then the English come in and they want a piece of the action. The French want a piece of the action. The Portuguese want a piece of the action. So it's this expansion, but also in the midst of all of this, there is nationalism. And part of what happens with the Protestant Reformation is nationalism. So whereas before you had the Holy Roman Empire, and it kind of was this overlord to all these different groups, now you have whatever king is king of this little place is going to be Protestant, whatever king over here is going to be, or queen over here is going to be Catholic, and so they're going to go at each other. And in all of that, they begin to produce scriptures that are specific to a language, a modern language, and so there develops a kind of nationalism with the Protestant Reformation, where whoever the king is or queen is gets to decide the religion of everybody else. So, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 is an enormous event. And what had happened before this, we talked about like the Mediterranean was kind of an Islamic lake. They kind of controlled things. Venice had some power and they could send ships, but it was really tough. Like Christians didn't want to live too close to the shores because they might be captured and enslaved, right? And trade on the Mediterranean was difficult. And there was an enormous naval battle in Lepanto in 1571. And this event kind of set a moment of decline for the Ottoman Empire. It had expanded and it was, ruler of the world. It was the great superpower, but it had lost at the Battle of Vienna and it had lost at the Battle of Lepanto. And so it was becoming less aggressive. And there was more trade available. It was just a time of blossoming of culture. But as you can see, the world divided in religion. So what had heretofore been Catholic, now you see this rise of nationalism. And some nations remained Catholic, and others took new religions, and their religions were not in agreement with one another. Right, so the Lutherans and the Catholic and the Lutherans and the Calvinists and the Anglicans, and the Zwingliists, they didn't agree with one another, except that the Pope was bad, right? Except that Catholicism was bad. So there was that was kind of the one doctrine that they could all agree upon. But it wasn't like a very orderly Reformation. It was kind of a disorderly thing. And in the middle of that, you can sort of see what's going to happen, and you're going to have war. You're going to have divorce. So, how does the church sort of survive in this? And it's not just happening, by the way, in Protestant countries. In France, which is a Catholic country, they have the French Revolution, and they wipe out all the priests, they kill all the nuns, and send everybody packing, and they have a war of the Vendée. And so, there's the Great Terror. They're sending anybody who disagrees with their highly secular form of government to the guillotine. So it's not just wars between nations. Sometimes it's chaos inside countries. And in part of this, and Deacon Tom asked this question about 2 weeks ago, or 2 times ago, he talked about the Enlightenment. And I think the Enlightenment is a mixed bag, right? I think on some level it's something that the church has kind of flourished in. Given, the United States of America, there's no overt and political suppression of Catholicism. And so you have a country which is becoming more and more Catholic over time, just because we're given the freedom, right, to live that way. Scotland is another example. Scotland had a long history of vehement anti-Catholicism with the Calvinists there. And, Catholics could basically not exist, practically speaking. But then they sort of loosened up a little bit on the laws, and now Catholics are probably more prominent in Scotland, amazingly, than are Protestants. So on some level, that Enlightenment idea that we're not going to oppress and push religion on people after those wars between the different countries and after all that violence, that Enlightenment idea to sort of, let's not try to dictate the religion. On some level it's been good, but on other levels it's not, right? And it's just part of, we live in a secular society, and so on some levels that, we can flourish in it, but it just means we have to adapt. But, it just tore Europe apart, and the 30-Year War is a perfect example. This is a war that happened within the Holy Roman Empire, right? So you've just got violence everywhere because of the Reformation. And so it wasn't just, I want to be some form of a Protestant, leave me alone. The Protestants fought different Protestants, the Catholics fought the Protestants fought the Catholics. There was a rebellion everywhere, it was violence. And so it was an ugly, there's a saying, there ain't no fight like a church fight, right? And that's, it was bad. And it still is bad. The Protestantism, is falling apart in this world, I think. You can see it sort of, but it's still, we need unity as Catholics, as Christians, as Westerners. That's a good thing. But what had been a Christian empire, right? The Holy Roman Empire had been a Catholic empire. Now it's suddenly, kind of secular, because there are parts of it that are Protestant, there are parts of it that aren't, parts of it that are Catholic. And so you've got this kind of indifference to religion. It doesn't mean the Habsburgs themselves were indifferent, but it meant, they had Muslims, they had Protestants, and they had Catholics, and they had people speaking many different languages within the empire. So, it was just a new way of life because of the Reformation. But in the midst of all of that some of those persecutions brought Europeans to the New World. And not just Europeans, because the Europeans also brought slaves to the New World, so it brought the whole world, really, almost to the New World. It was a transplanting of society and of culture, and it was a new moment of, I think, a great chapter in human history. It doesn't mean that there weren't horrible things that happened, but there were also great things that happened. And there's a great result of all those things, right? So that was the sort of silver lining in the cloud. They were persecuted in Britain. They had a sympathetic king in Charles I. He said, well, y'all go over and you can start a colony, and you can name it after my wife, Maria. So they named it Maryland, right? And the Catholics were like, yeah, it's really for Mary, right? But, it was kind of but it was a moment of breath, where they could establish themselves and not be persecuted. It didn't last long. The Protestants took over again, and eventually became, the Catholics had to almost hide again. But it planted the seed in the New World. But the English Civil War was part of it too. So in the one side of the Civil War, the English goes to New England, the other side goes to Britain. So, depending on who's persecuting and who's escaping and who's trying to get out with their lives, that all has an influence on who comes to the New World. The Irish potato famine, another great example. A horrible event, an absolutely horrible event, and yet we have so many people in Georgia today who are alive because they escaped with their lives to the New World with in that moment. There's a... So, King Charles I is the man for whom his wife is, the man was named for Maryland. First of all, Elizabeth I is for whom Virginia is, the colony of Virginia is named. James, her nephew, is the man for whom Jamestown is named. There's Charles I, William and Mary, they have the college. Then there's Charles I. He's the one who's decapitated by the Protestants because he's not Protestant enough in England, right? And they start the Republic there. And then he's the one for whom South Carolina and North Carolina are named. After the time of Cromwell, they brought back Charles II. He's the man for whom Charleston is named. And so you get all of, you can sort of look at the old cities and the old states in America, and you can sort of just see a lot of history just based on the names of Augusta and Charlotte. All these are, these are the kings and the queens, and York, New York. That's another one. It's named for a Catholic, actually. Charles II was Catholic. He died Catholic on his deathbed. And there's a great story about the parents of James Oglethorpe, and they were guarding the door as the Catholic priest came in so that Charles II could be received into the Catholic Church. And their son, James Oglethorpe, was the founder of Georgia. So all of these they have a really interesting tie in this history. But James II is the last of the English monarchs to be Catholic, and New York is named for him. He was the Duke of York, and again, the colonies are kind of reflecting the monarchy, but also this back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism. In the midst of all of this, Freemasonry evolves in the early 18th century. It's a secular kind of new religion. One of the things that's happening, I think, in all of this confusion is you see, well, if the Catholics and the Protestants can't agree on things, and if the Protestants and the Protestants and the Protestants and the Protestants and the Protestants can't agree on things, then maybe we need something new. And so every time you're kind of trying to see these people come up with new ideas. One of them was the Quakers, right? We're going to just be friends. We're not going to make a big deal out of this. We're going to be past this. And you can sort of see things get a little weirder and weirder as they're trying to sort of stop the violence. And one of the things that I think that evolves in all of that is Freemasonry, and it's kind of a New Age religion. It's certainly not Christian. It's not, I would say, not even compatible with Catholicism. And yet it's a kind of virtue-based thing. And again, it's a way of sort of redefining the world through the eyes of the Enlightenment. And it becomes an enormous challenge to the Catholic Church. So we have the 7 Years' War. That's a war that begins in America. Basically, it begins in, I want to say, Pittsburgh, or very near. So the French are coming south, and they're trying to connect to the Mississippi River from what we call French Canada. And so they're going through the Alleghenies, and they're going down to this Fort Duquesne, which they called it. And the people of Virginia says, wait a minute, Fort Duquesne is Virginian. So they send this young whippersnapper, George Washington, up to sort of stop this advancement. And there breaks out a war. And it's really the first World War. We don't call it the First World War, but it's one of the first epic global wars. And it's between the French and the English. But because the French and the English are now colonizing parts of the world, these colonies are also bringing wars, exporting wars to the rest of the empire. So, if you have some territorial dispute in the backwoods of Pennsylvania, or what became Pennsylvania, that can actually create tensions, political tensions, and even violence all around the world between the different parties. By the way, the UK wins that, right? And part of the reason that they're taxing American citizens in the middle of the 18th century is to try to pay for some of the war. And that's going to cause a lot of Virginians and a lot of people from Massachusetts to say, wait a minute, we can't have taxation without representation. So all of these things, like one thing leads to another, and it causes like a game of, where the cards all the dominoes start to fall. And you can sort of see how, again, the Enlightenment comes into play, and in the United States anyway, what becomes the United States, they take the best, I think, of the Enlightenment ideals. They're not anti-Catholic, they're not anti-Christian, but because no one can figure out Catholic or Protestant, or which Protestant, because no one wants to continue to fight more wars about religion, there's a kind of indifference. And that comes in with the government, and so there's a freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. And so there's a plurality of ideas, and in theory anyway, not always in practice, in theory, the country should be indifferent, right? And that is, I think, interesting because it's going to lead to a kind of peace after the Protestant Reformation, where Protestants and Catholics can start to get along a little better, but it's also going to open the door for Islam to come in, right? Because before, as a united sort of religion, where the two were connected, the country and the empire and the religion were connected, you can have a kind of, endorsement of, not necessarily suppression of other religions, but endorsement of a truth. Whereas now, with the indifference of the Enlightenment, people just raise their hands and say, I can't decide, you decide for yourself. And so it's going to pose a different problem for us moving forward as Westerners. The French Revolution, very, sort of the same ideas, but very different results, right? Very different. And, the person who's supposed to bring an end to the disorder of the French Revolution is Napoleon. He was, the French love him. I don't think anybody else in Europe loves him, right? But he, he wanted to take over everything. He wanted to build an empire. He was even in Africa. He was all over the place. He was, again, that idea of the empire, but it's less Christian, more secular. But ultimately, he ends up failing. But we purchased the Louisiana Purchase from him, so that was pretty good. We got a bargain. In all of this, you've got extraordinary people coming to the fore. And some of them, like Mother Seton, is a great example. She's a convert from the Episcopal or Anglican tradition. She's raised in New York. I think her grandfather was the pastor at Trinity, Episcopal Church down near Wall Street. Her birth home is there on the wharf, the Battery in Manhattan. So she was from sort of upper crust society, and she became Catholic, lost everything in the process, was basically impoverished, but she was the perfect example of, go and sell everything you have for that pearl of great price. And so she took Catholicism out to the frontier in Emmitsburg, lived in a log cabin with a dirt floor, and established basically what we call the school system in the United States of America. The public school system comes later, right? Because it's kind of a trying to catch up with the Catholic school system. So she's a great pioneer and a great example of American Catholicism. Charles Carroll is the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a man of vision. He was the wealthiest man in the country. He was a man who founded railroads. He lived long enough to found railroads, and he was a great person, I think, to read, to understand the mindset of Catholics at the time. And his whole family had been persecuted back in Ireland, right? So they had lost everything. And so when they came to the new colonies, they began to establish themselves and grew in wealth and influence. And yet, under English law, they could still not participate in government. And so when the time comes for the decision to be made as to whether to rebel against King George, I think Charles Carroll of Carrollton had a lot of history of anti-Catholicism in the past, and it just probably made it easier to say yes, right? Easier to say yes. And the end result, of course, is the experiment of plurality of religion and religious freedom that had started in Maryland by Catholics became something that the United States of America embraced in whole. And so the so in Georgia, for example, there had been Spanish Catholic missions in the 16th century, but they were wiped out by the English. But after the Constitution and religious liberty, Catholics could return to Georgia in 1790. There's a book that I'm reading right now on Catholicism and the Civil War. It's an excellent book, and it's trying to grapple with that very complicated piece of history for our nation and what it means, and how Catholics were a kind of minority in it, but how did they respond to it? It's fascinating. And one of the things that you learn about it is just not very easy to sort of know the right side of things. We look back at it and we think, well, there's a clear right side of it. But when you were in the front of it, when it was happening before you, it wasn't certain. Like, for example, most of the people who were abolitionists hated Irish, they hated immigrants, they hated Catholics. So, like, how do you vote for these people, right, when you're Catholic? So, it made a very curious historical moment in the church's history. It's like, how do you respond with all of these moral issues? Anyway, it's an interesting thing to read about. So, the Pope is condemning slavery, and yet all of that is unfolding in blood and tears in the United States of America. Not that we don't have slavery, we have more slaves now than we did then. They're just not in the United States. But in the West, again, this was a high moment of sort of once again grappling with the issue of slavery, which had come back through the Enlightenment, right? And so again, an enormous epic battle, really, for human rights. So one of the things that is pertinent to our Catholicism here in the state of Georgia, again, the Freemasons were anti-Catholic, and they control a lot of small-town Georgia towns even today. You go to these events and everybody's got their Masonic pin on. But also the Klan. The Klan was I mean, it may exist. I never see it, but it was vehemently anti-Catholic. So I have a physician who's a Basque. His father and mother had come to Georgia from Spain, and they were Catholic, and they weren't only going to just employ or care for or cure a one kind of person. And so he remembers as a child in Atlanta a cross being burned in his yard, right? So that struggle against anti-Catholicism is a great story for us, I think, to remember and to keep in mind and to teach our children. But in the middle of all of that, you've got some really great examples of priests. You've got Father Peter Whalen, who was the Angel of Andersonville. He had been a prisoner of war in New York as a Confederate who was arrested and taken there. And he was given freedom eventually, and he came back to Georgia, and he was sent to Andersonville, which is the notorious POW camp that is in southwest Georgia, and there he cared for many, many sick, dying Union soldiers who were in the worst possible conditions. A great person for us to know about. Also, Father Thomas Riley. He is a priest who saved a number of churches and buildings from being burned down in Atlanta. A great example, I think. We have some of the oldest hospital in Atlanta is Catholic. So even though Catholics were persecuted, even though they were kind of marginalized, not necessarily respected, there was a lot of really interesting things that happened, not just in Georgia, but in the country. This transformative work of charity and love that we call the Catholic Church. And another example, I don't have them on here, but the Healy's of Georgia. I don't know if you know the Healy family in Georgia, but Mr. Healy was an Irishman, and he was in a common law marriage with a woman who was African and a slave. And they had, I think, like 14 children. And it was a lot of children. And those children were by law slaves in Georgia. And so the Healys sent their kids to Canada and to be educated. And so you've got like the second founder of Georgetown University is one of the Healy sons. The first bishop of Maine is a Healy son. There's a fellow who worked for the Vatican who's a Healy son. There's a number of sisters. One of the really sort of kind of founding fathers, if you will, of the Coast Guard also is a Healy. So that whole family, they deserve to be known and remembered. So this whole idea of nationalism leads us to World War I, right? Unchecked nationalism. And World War I leads us to World War II. So, these are not wars of religion at this point. These are very much secular wars. And they make every other war pale by comparison. And they're just completely destructive. And in the midst of all of that, the Catholic Church is like, stop, please stop, don't do this. But we did it to ourselves. So Western society, there's a sickness inside the Western society. And I think we're grappling with that too, right now. So you see a kind of the gifts of Western society, the positive things that come out of Western society, but there's also a kind of need for, I would say, evangelization, right, to the West. Because the West has kind of lost its way. And in the middle of all that, you have these Nevertheless, you have these great people like Blessed Crawl and Empress Zita and Edith Stein and all these modern saints, and there's so many of them. And one of the things that John Paul II said is, I want the world to know that in the middle of all of this chaos, there have been some fantastic heroes. And so you see a lot, he beatified and canonized more saints, I think, than any other pope ever in history. Because he wanted people to see that it wasn't just, European saints from the 4th century. There were saints all over the world, in every continent, who were caught up in this epic, wonderful sort of struggle to proclaim Christ and to live as Catholics. And they needed to be told. And their stories act as a kind of counterbalance to the excesses of secularism and to the excesses of sort of an anti-Christian mentality that's still prevalent in our society today. I don't want to pick on people, but you cannot have a cross in a classroom or read the Bible, but you can probably read the Quran. We're that funny. We're like, well, the Quran is cultural, but you can't read the Bible. So, we have a kind of weird neurosis about our own origins, and it's not a healthy thing. That having been said, the church has nevertheless grown, which it just goes to show you, it's like, no matter what, the Lord's kind of in control of all this, right? So, with the Protestant Reformation, kings and princes and queens wanting power had taken over the church in their countries so that they could become all-powerful. Within almost 20, 30 years from that, they became puppets. And the people with power became more the lords, right? The higher upper class. And even today, it's like, the King of England doesn't really have any power, right? It's a figurehead. So, in order to gain power, they took over the church, placed themselves ahead of their churches, and forced Protestant religion, and then they lost power. And now, those religions, in England, for example, more Catholics go to Mass than Episcopalians or Anglicans go to services. So it's remarkable to see, despite all of our best efforts to screw the world up, how God, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, works nevertheless to bring people to salvation. But one of the things that is bad, I think, about the loss of the empire, this has been a kind of parallel march between the church and the empire. When there was an empire, or when there was a king or a queen who was Catholic, there was a lay voice, right? So if the Pope got wackadoodle, the Holy Roman Emperor could say, wait a minute, right? So there was another voice that was not clergy, that was a layperson, that had a kind of parallel authority that could actually be used in a way to reform the church. We don't have that now, right? Whereas we had that in the monarchy, and we had that in the empire, the Christian empire. We kind of don't have that now, and I think we're poor for that. I think that kind of powerful lay, it could cause problems, there's no doubt, there's no question, but so can bishops unchecked or popes unchecked. We need that kind of, the powerful laity in the monarchy and in the empire was a kind of a check and balance against sometimes when the church went a little too far this way or a little too far that way, or didn't go this far that way or this far. So I think we're at a new chapter, right? And we're 10 years away from the 2,000-year mark of the founding of the Catholic Church on Pentecost. And we have some questions to ask ourselves, and, not that we necessarily know the answers, but where are we in all this, and how are we going to sort of move and form and reform and work with Catholicism in our lives here in Georgia, but also in the world. Where is the church going? And I think those are bold questions to ask. And I see a lot of things that are happening now that I think are unfortunate in the church. A lot of people who have pointed hats probably need to stop talking, right? So there's need for reform. And not every bishop is a good bishop, and not every cardinal is a good cardinal, and so they're not agreeing with one another, so we're in a moment of crisis. And maybe we always have been, but it seems very acute now. But I have confidence, right, that the Lord is sort of the master of history. And so, on some level, I can roll my eyes and complain about how difficult this is, and it is difficult because I want the salvation of my parishioners. I want, I'm for the salvation of souls, and I see so many things tearing us apart. And yet, on the other hand, it's also kind of maybe a heroic moment to be Catholic if we do it right. So that's something for you to pray about. So I think I've got 2,000 years of history, and we're doing okay there, Peter?
Great.
Yeah. Any questions, thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Just one thought. I'm not a historian. I'm a biochemist. So, but I like hearing the historical background. The "Thou shalt not kill," yet the Christians are fighting.
Right.
How do they justify?
Well, Christians are, so the question is, thou shalt not kill, and how do Christians end up being fighting?
Yeah.
Well, it's just, even today in the gospel, it's like he who takes up the sword will perish with the sword. But, when the empire and the church sink, there's just, that's part of something that the church has to grapple with. Whether you can have a just war, right? And not all wars are just. And not both sides of the war aren't necessarily just. But I can tell you there's a really interesting history of that because, and it happens early on. Like we have an icon of St. Maurice in the church. You can think of a lot of soldier saints. St. Martin is in the church. St. Sebastian. So there's a time early on where you begin to see soldiers becoming Catholic. And that brings about a sort of change in the mindset of Catholics. And so it becomes less of a pacifist religion. But part of it, too, is just being attacked, right? With Islam forcing its way in, and a lot of Catholics, even today, I think, we're kind of passive, right? We don't want to say things that will upset people. That's part of our whole nature. But you can push us enough to where we say, okay, darn it, that's it, right? And I think you just find, you cross lines eventually. Any more? Thank you.
Yeah.
You got one question?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned about, on one of the slides, the first Mass in Baltimore,
Right.
Maryland. So it reminded me of Baltimore, which reminded me of what's over our shoulders, the crests of the diocese. Right. And you want us to know about those crests. Can you talk about them?
Right. So if you turn around and look at the back wall, the one on the far left is the Diocese of Baltimore. That's the first diocese in the United States of America. That's the Coward Cross, and it came from the founding family of the Marylanders, the Cowards, who actually I'm my family's connected to, but anyway, so that's the Diocese of Baltimore. And then there was a split. And so the Diocese of Charleston is next. You see the line of England. First bishop, who was actually Irish, but his name was England. Bishop England, a great, great man, was the first bishop of Charleston. And so we became part of the Diocese of Charleston. And then the Vatican says, well, Georgia's got enough Catholics in it, barely enough to have one diocese. So the next one you see with the cross and the 4 stars, that's the Diocese of Savannah. And then in the 1930s or so, they said, well, maybe Atlanta is kind of going to grow, so we'll make it a diocese in and of itself. And so you see our history as Catholics there. The flags above me, too, are also emblematic of our Georgian Catholic history. So the different sort of moments in history that we live through and the different influences and peoples who come to this world. I just have to say that I think Georgians are fascinating people. I love Atlantans. I love my parishioners. And, you know, we all have interesting stories. I was talking to one of our parishioners, Tony. He had just had his DNA done. And he said that he was just so proud. And I just loved it because he was like, I'm this part, you know, from this part of Mexico to this part of Mexico, this part Jewish, this part Spanish, this part African, this part African, this part. You know, it was just like, that's who we are, right, as Americans. We're just, if we've been here long enough, we're a little bit of the whole world. And and I think, this may be bold to say, but I think in some way, that's why Americans can help the rest of the world. Because we kind of represent, as much as possible, that secular empire is still sort of surviving, right? Not in name, but kind of in spirit. But we're also a blend of so many things. So anyway, I gotta go. God bless you.